My name is Zinat Rahman. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Politics, and we're so pleased to welcome you to a discussion regarding rural America and its adaptation to economic challenges through the growth, sale, and consumption of food. Before one of our students introduces our guest in a few minutes, I want to mention a couple of events that we have upcoming at the IOP and go over some housekeeping. So tomorrow we are hosting a virtual event at 10 a.m., moderated by Washington Post columnist James McCauley on France's presidential election, and you definitely still have time to sign up for that. On Friday, April 1st, author and activist Golwali Pasarleh will join us for an event with the Institute of Politics International Policy Program to discuss refugee rights, the global humanitarian crisis, and European immigration policy. And then next week, we're throwing a little conference from April 6th to April 8th. The Institute of Politics and the Atlantic will be jointly hosting a conference called Disinformation and the Erosion of Democracy, which is a 3-day conference exploring the spread of disinformation and strategies to respond to it. And all of that will be live streamed, so if you want to catch it between classes, you can do that. For questions tonight, after tonight's moderated discussion, we'll open the floor to take questions from you in the audience. And please line up to ask your questions at the microphone, which will be like right there, I believe. And as usual, we'll give priority first to questions asked by students. Please make sure your phones are on silent. And now I'd like to welcome Priya Patel to the stage, who we will hear formal introductions of our speakers from. Priya is a fourth-year student in the college, majoring in public policy and minoring in critical race and ethnic studies. Priya previously served as the voting ambassador chair for You Shy Votes, as well as a fellow ambassador leader for Heidi Heitkamp. Please join me in welcoming Priya to the podium.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today. It is my pleasure to introduce you to the guests for this evening's discussion. Senator Heidi Heitkamp is the former Democratic senator for North Dakota from 2013 to 2019, having previously been the state's attorney general and tax commissioner. She has been an incredible advocate for the rural community in her state and around the country. During her time in the Senate, she worked hard to write and pass policies to secure the economic future of farmers in her state, promote responsible, efficient energy practices, expand access to health care, and to create measures to protect Native American communities in her state. Senator Heitkamp is also the founder of the One Country Project, an organization focused on creating a dialogue about issues that impact rural communities across America. Joining her today are Illinois farmers Jahari Cole and Marty Travis. Jahari works for Iyabo Farms, a family-run business in Pembroke Township. She is also a member of the Pembroke Farmers Cooperative, a group of farmers who united in 1999 to economically support and sustain small business farms in the Pembroke area. Marty Travis is a 7th-generation farmer who owns and operates Spence Farms in Livingston County. Marty is also the author of the book, My Farmer, My Customer, which provides guidance about how to successfully build long-term family-run farms which can provide healthy foods to its customers. Our moderator for today's discussion is Jennifer Steiner, the director of the IOP Speaker Series. Before joining the IOP, Jennifer worked at the New York Times for 25 years and is the author of several books, including 2 cookbooks. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
Thank you so much for that intro, and thank you to everyone for coming, especially our guests here on the podium. It's so great to be with you tonight. So let's just dive right in. I think we all know that there's so much mythology in America around rural life, and specifically around agriculture, especially now as we're very connected more to our foodways. And that mythology connects to how we prepare food, how we think about eating, how we think about American history, the way we think about American politics. And a lot of it is based in mythology. And I would love to kind of unpack some of that today, starting with you, Senator, because you have both the federal and in the state, statewide look at some of what those misconceptions are and how and what the actual challenges are that may be in conflict with how non-rural Americans perceive them, especially as it pertains to agriculture.
Yeah, I think I get a little nervous because I think I'm probably representing the corporate side of farming, although I have to tell you in North Dakota, we do not allow corporations to own farmland. We're the only state in the union. I think Nebraska has some limitations, but we're pretty jealous about making sure that our farmland is owned by families, is owned by people who are going to keep the land in production. And then the question becomes, what do you do with it? And I think our image of agriculture, as we get more and more generations away from the farm. I mean, my husband grew up on a family farm. I was just one generation off the family farm. But we lived in a subdivision, kind of a small town subdivision, as we were raising our kids. And we went around the neighborhood and we realized that our 2 children were the only 2 children in North Dakota, in Mandan, North Dakota, who had ever been to a farm. I mean, think about that. And so the image that people have about farming is built on those children's books about what does a cow say, you know, what does it look like, or it's America in Gothic, when you think about that great masterpiece that somehow represents America, or all of the great Dorothea Lange photographs from the Dust Bowl. And I think there is a romanticism about American agriculture that is worthy, that is born out of Thomas Jefferson's ideal or idyllic notion of what a democracy is going to be. And his version and vision was always agrarian, right? The best America was agrarian America. Well, we know that only now 10 to 15% of the people in our country, can we say, actually live in rural communities, in what I would consider rural communities. And so what I would like you to maybe think about is rural America is more diverse than what you think. And I can show you pockets of diversity, whether it is immigrants who have moved into places where they can get jobs working in a turkey farm in Wilmer, North Dakota. There's lots of Somali. It's a whole community that has been dramatically changed by people coming, immigrants coming. Whether it is Native Americans, most Native American communities are rural communities. Whether it is African American in the Black Belt or in places of historic kind of land ownership challenges. And so what I would tell you is this image that you have of rural America is maybe monolithic, and that's not fair because it's much more diverse. And you're going to hear a really diverse perspective here about agriculture, and probably me representing North Dakota, I can tell you all about what the corn growers want. I can tell you about the soybean growers want. I can tell you what the ethanol industry wants. I can tell you what the wheat growers want. And these tend to be very large units. And so the average size in North Dakota of a farm is about 5,000 acres. You're going to hear something completely different on this side in terms of profitability. But as we have looked at equipment getting more expensive, right now a combine with the right header is going to be over $1 million. Yeah. That's an input cost that a soybean grower will experience in his or her lifetime. If you look at grain handling systems, if you look at fertilizer costs, all of this really drives the economics of large production. And in order to make it work, you have to get bigger. And that's a trend that I think a lot of us are really concerned about. The fact that farmers are getting bigger, farms are getting bigger, more and more removed from the actual connection to that family-owned unit. And how do you reestablish that connection, I think is a challenge for the future.
Johari, I would love to hear you respond to that, because I think that the senator raised a lot of issues that you might be on the other side of, especially in terms of size and scale, but it also a very interesting different historical perspective.
Thank you. Absolutely. And I'm coming on the complete opposite end or side of that, where most of the families that we work with, the average size is 5 acres. Yeah. If you're doing 20 acres, you're a big farm in our community. Even my own personal farm, even though we have 52 acres of land, we're only farming as a family less than 5 acres at a time. That's as much as we can do. I mean, you spoke about Thomas, Jefferson back in the day, where agrarian communities were the fabric of America, but that was based off of cheap labor called slavery. And now, as you progress through the years, once that institution was done, you have all these huge farms with no labor. So a lot of the things that we've had to do was switch our whole ideology, our whole way of farming. So a lot of the farmers who were 1 and 2 or small family farms had to get, in order to be able to survive, they got larger, started specializing in 1 or 2 crops, as opposed to the multiple crops back in the day, which actually fed the plates of people. Now we're using larger, you know, the 5,000 acres to give the base meals, the grains, the rice, the breads, you know, but the greens, the other vegetables, those are most likely coming from the smaller guys like us. The lettuce, you know, all of the things that add that color, that extra color and dimension to your plate are coming from the smaller guys. You know, and so we have to think about that, unless it's a, you know, a larger farmer that's specifically dealing like with monocrops of tomatoes. And you have, you know, large, and even those are starting to get, you know, a little bit out of hand, like you were mentioning, because there's a lot of those farmers that are dealing with a lot of, you can't, especially in the organic field. I'm an organic farmer, I have been for 30 years. Before that, my family, I was raised on an organic farm. Well, we didn't call it organic. We just didn't use any of the pesticides and fertilizers and all the other stuff, right? That it was just innate. You know, you're gonna work with the land that you have and the God-given, you know, things that you have to make those vegetables grow. So it was never coined organic, but that was the only way I knew to raise food. So, so in the organic business, it's very difficult to start raising, you know, even going into larger fields without being compromised. And so I noticed that even with the organic standards, there's always this edging to the edge of right at the precipice of you're not organic anymore. Right. Yeah. So a lot of people are pushing those boundaries even when they have to scale up. My personal family farm, we were asked to grow grain, corn for Horizon Organics, the dairy farms, because there's a shortage of corn, organic corn, for, you know, for the cows. And we were asked to do that, and we were like, I'm sorry, we just, it's just beyond what we are willing to do. So there is a cutoff point of how big you want to go. And I know we employ 2 to 3 people at a time at our farm, and that's still a lot to do.
And Marty, you're kind of, you're sitting in the middle, and you're sort of in the middle. What is your perception, picking up where they left off, and kind of bringing it back, if you could, to the question of mythology too, and what people perceive life, like someone like you, they see your farm, just like our food tonight, they see it on a menu in a restaurant, and they probably have an image of what that means and what that's like. What can you pop there for that bubble?
So our family's been on our farm in another 8 years, 200 years.
That's awesome.
So my son and his wife, their kids, my grandkids, are 9th generation. We have a 160-acre farm. It's the original 160 acres we bought from the government. That seems huge.
It is huge.
It is. Sorry, but I want to say something too to the fact that there is still romance on a farm.
Yeah. Absolutely.
There is, and we view ourselves as being part of that ecosystem, and that we still enjoy our nature walks. We enjoy the sunsets or the sunrise and all of those pieces. At the same time, we know our work involves creating food. And we are just as committed as any other farmer to providing that food. And we have our neighbors that are mostly conventional farmers. And I said this earlier, that they're always driving real slow past our place, wondering what in the world are they planting now? What in the world do you have growing out there? But that's a good thing, because it's causing that tension. And I had one neighbor farmer that grows conventional. He said, "What do you got across the road?" And I said, "Those are potatoes." He says, how much do you make on an acre of potatoes? I says, more than you want me to tell you. And he says, I'm losing my farm. He said, if I clear $50 an acre, I'm doing really good.
Wow.
So
That's a concern.
It is a concern.
And driven by high input prices, which you guys are controlling by your practices, driven by soil erosion. I mean, there's just a lot of challenges on all sides, whether it's market challenges, but you know, the bottom line is when you look at agriculture, there's got to be room for everything. So you all now are looking at plant-based proteins, right? Guess where you get those? You get those from peas and beans and edibles that are grown in North Dakota. We have a climate that is conducive to growing edibles. And we're proud of that. Most of the black beans that you might see in your grocery store probably came from North Dakota.
Yes.
You might not know that, but the whole point is there's got to be a role for all of this, and we've got to, I mean, we've got to grow to the market. And whether that is we're going to stop doing GMO, you got to figure out where the market is, and you got to grow to the market in spite of the fact that there's always some resistance to say it doesn't matter if it's organic, it doesn't matter if it's non-GMO. And you want to say it matters to the person who's eating the food.
Yes.
And so you're going to have to figure out, because the customer's always right, the consumer's always right.
And we're going to get to some of the market challenges and inputs, but I want to kind of tie this first back to current events, because current events obviously hit every industry. Let's start with the pandemic. We know we've all experienced the supply chain, and we certainly felt it right away in our food system. We couldn't get our yeast for our sourdough, and we couldn't, that was cream cheese. I mean, there were all these like sort of rolling shortages. But tell us about that from your perspective as purveyors.
I can understand the cream cheese one.
That was a kind of a other thing.
I don't
but
understand.
I just throw it out there.
Were the cows, did they stop producing because of the pandemic? I mean, I didn't understand the cream cheese. But anyway, eventually someone had to break it down to me. But yeah, the pandemic was interesting because I think a lot of fear happened about grocery stores shutting down, or that food insecurity happened. And for the first time, and I would say in 20 years, literally 20 years, did the balls turn toward the smaller agricultural producer. And we were getting inundated with calls. Can you provide food, like greens, whatever, to the WIC centers, to the homeless shelters, to the hospitals? We were literally getting inundated with these calls. Unfortunately, a lot of the calls were coming in like July after we have already planted, because people don't understand the production process of food. So if you want me to put a big order in, I need to know that in January when I need to buy the seeds, because they're in the ground by May, so just that process was very interesting. But then it also shed a light on that we couldn't get a lot of things as regular producers were shut off. I'm a poultry grower, we raise our own birds as well. All of a sudden, everyone wanted to raise chickens. I couldn't get either meat birds, I couldn't get grain to feed the chickens, I couldn't even get bedding. It was just not there. It was very interesting. But now this year, I hear there's a lot of chickens running around free in the streets.
Some of them are in the District of Columbia, I can tell you.
They're free ranging now.
Yes,
They're free ranging because they started off all cute and everyone wanted to, and then they said, this is a lot of work. Turn them critters out in the street. So it was just kind of funny. But yeah, so during those 2 years it was and we were offered even funding from the government directly to farmers that never happened before. It was always through another organization or something like that. So it was a lot of farmers were, wow, we're essential?
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Well,
that was the conversation.
The pandemic did reveal what we think of as essential in an interesting way. Where would you pick up on that in terms of your challenges?
We, for the last 15, 20 years, we have mainly supplied restaurants and small grocery stores with most of our product. In January, I always meet with all of our chefs, and so that January I met with most of our chefs and asked them, what if we saw what was happening in other parts of the world. What if, do you have a plan? None of them had a plan.
Nobody has a plan.
Nobody. So I came home and I said to my son, Will, I says, we need to get our act together. So when the pandemic happened and the shutdown happened, the week before we had delivered to 40 restaurants. This was in March. The following week we had 3. But in that period of time, in that week, Will had put out a social media post. Anybody that's interested in having access to the same kind of food that we do for our restaurants, we had 800 people respond.
Yeah.
That's way too many. We did 200, and we struggled hard, not fulfilling it, but changing our whole system of distribution. It was one of the hardest things I think I've experienced. I ended up working 90 to 100 hours a week, just keeping all of our farmers together and keeping them motivated and in a good spot. We were able to do it, and one thing led to another, and it led to a lot of entrepreneurship of other distribution channels. And the filmmaker that did our sustainable documentary became an online grocery store with curbside pickup.
Sure did. Yeah.
And we're thrilled.
There's a lot of restaurants that turned into grocery stores too.
Absolutely.
I'm a vendor of his as well, the online grocery store. He has an actual establishment now.
Yep.
But
And some of that's
It's real.
stayed.
actual,
It's
brick and mortar
continued.
store.
With another current event, Senator, if you could kick it off talking about the war in Ukraine. I think Ukraine and Russia together were expected to account for about 30% of global wheat exports. I'm curious what you're seeing. You're seeing on the ground too, but Senator, what you see, how that's played out domestically, but also as part of the whole, World Food Program.
Just to comment about the pandemic, one of the things that the pandemic taught us is that the food supply chain, because it has become so heavily concentrated, can be easily disrupted.
Yeah.
And so now there is a big push for diversification, especially in meat processing, a big push for diversification of supply chains. The other thing that it taught us is how important labor is, and we don't appreciate it. I will say, I once, with my sisters, picked 5 acres all summer of cucumbers.
Yeah.
If you want to work hard, pick 5 acres of cucumbers.
Absolutely.
For your grandfather, who was basically one of the early truck farmers, because he had all that free grandchildren labor. But Ukraine is a, you've heard a lot about the energy crisis that's coming about because of Ukraine, right? So, gas shortages, what that looks like in Europe, gas prices rising, some concern about generation of electricity in Europe. How do you replace that? Biden now saying we're going to try and figure out how we transport or export North American natural gas. Okay, the next thing that is going to be on the discussion table is the food crisis. So you just heard 30% of all wheat is grown in Ukraine and Russia. What you don't know is 50% of the World Food Program's grain comes from Russia and Ukraine. And they're already seeing exacerbations of what's happening in Yemen, where the World Food Program is actively engaged. Fertilizer, potash coming out of Belarus. This doesn't, on the organic side, it may not be as critical, but for large-scale grain farmers, the fertilizer shortage probably won't hit us this bad, because most of my farmers, what they do is they apply their fertilizer in the fall. It's cheaper to buy in the fall traditionally, so they're going to and they probably had a pretty good year, so they wanted to expense it in the fall. But now they see the input costs rising, whether it is drying of the grain with propane, or whether it is diesel fuel for the tractor, whatever that is. And so you see countries like Egypt right now basically shutting down any exports. You see people, this global supply chain that we have created that was disrupted during the pandemic is now being exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. And so it's now reminding people, not only do we need to worry about getting our pharmaceuticals from China, getting our metals from someplace that is someplace that has social disruption, you know, rebels. I mean, you know, all of these issues that you have are now coming to front in the food environment. And so how do we then think about this as Americans? So in America, we have two things that we do pretty well. We produce energy. We're the #1 energy producer in the world. And we have the technology to do renewables. We have what it takes to supply beyond our borders energy. We also have the #1 agricultural productivity. Whether you agree with how that's being produced or not, we have the system in place to produce a lot of food.
Yes, we do.
How do we move it? And are we going to be insular in terms of how we approach this? So what about a policy where it is America first? Are we going to shut down exports of our grain, of our edibles, to basically keep prices low in our country? Or are we going to figure out how we can play that all-important role that we've always played, which is food for democracy? And so you're going to see, I think, a lot of discussion about what happens as a result of this. And then the question becomes, as you've heard here, what are the long-term changes that we need to learn from as we look going forward?
And do you two feel that? Do you have a direct connection in your lives right now to what's going on in Ukraine?
Well, I definitely see it, and is it impacting our farm directly? Not so much specifically, but indirectly it is, just because of we see, you know, the supply chain that's hindering, you know, any other kind of things and needs that we have for our own farm. Yeah, so we see it that way.
I just had a conversation before coming here with one of our chefs, and he was looking at costs, and he said, I would really love to switch this whole facility where he works into local grains. But he says it's like 5 times the cost of what it is conventionally.
Yeah.
I says, you just wait. I says, we'll be there.
We'll be there.
And we'll maybe end up being the cheap person. So it is affecting us in maybe a good way for now, but I think we all are really watching the news and hoping for better.
You look at you know, what we used to say is, why are Europeans so absolutely adamant in trade negotiations to protect their agriculture? Because they know what it's like to be hungry. They remember World War II, and the further we get away from that, we don't know in this country. And the question is, when you have food insecurity in places like Syria, it results in political insecurity, and it results in people doing things that they wouldn't do otherwise. And so it is in our best interest to figure out how the United States of America can play an all-critical role in growing more food for a hungry world. And it's not going to necessarily be that farm-to-table, all-important farm-to-table stuff that's happening now. It's going to be in the large grains. It's going to be in more production, what we consider production agriculture. And it's absolutely critical that we understand, especially for the next grow season, because this is coming on us at a time when no one's going to plant wheat in North Dakota anymore. That decision was made, you know, months ago. And so how do you replace wheat? How do you replace barley? How do you replace sunflower oil? And so these are all really critical challenges that we're going to have to confront in American agriculture, and it's going to be absolutely critical for making sure that we have democracy flourishing in the world.
And food insecurity obviously is an issue here domestically too. Obviously, I'm going to turn to that. But before, I do want to kind of tie some of these threads that we've been kind of hinting about organics. We know that the notion of organic farming is that it would help rebuild soil, cost farmers less in petroleum-based inputs. We've been talking about inputs. How has it played out, maybe in the context of regenerative agriculture, and you know, is the promise of organic, has it been realized?
I was on the Organic Research Foundation board, which is the national board, for 7 years. I've seen large ag producers switch to regenerative ag or organic farming, and with success. It's possible. There is more, it's just a paradigm shift of getting off of the dependency of certain things, such as really getting off of a lot of fossil fuel dependency, which is the base of a lot of the fertilizer inputs and other inputs that they, and other chemical inputs. And just literally putting in a more holistic environment where it is a lot more permaculture based. So it's a lot more work involved with doing it that way, but it is possible. And just being able to, we have to find a way to regenerate our soils. Soil is the basis of our food. That determines whether your food is going to be nutritionally sound or not. And it all starts with that soil. And so regenerative ag is basically literally putting, the attention back into the soil and making sure it's healthy first before putting one seed in the ground. And we have to get back to that notion because we've got to do something to save our planet. The more, if we are, we are creating systems now where we're other dust bowls. I look even in our community where we have a lot of large agricultural production, and you can just see it on a satellite where it's been farmed so much that it's literally just dust. And the unfortunate thing, it becomes a revolving cycle of now there's no nutrients in the ground anymore. You have to put artificial fertilizer into it in order to do that. The whole ecosystem is imbalanced, so now you have to put in, insecticides and pesticides. So you create the cycle that is not in keeping with the natural order of things. And so that's the unfortunate thing when we get not too big, it's a matter of just needing to change our whole paradigm of how we farm again.
Is that your experience? Is that how you would perceive it?
It is. And as much as there's this cycle that goes just exactly what Johari's saying, there's also a cycle over here of regeneration and
Yes.
renewal. And we, on our farm and throughout all of our farmers that are part of our collaborative, we're using technology to understand what that plant, what that crop needs, not doing a mass dose, but really defining what that crop needs to be super immune. It's the same way with us as humans.
Absolutely.
If we have total immunity, we can sit in a crowd and not catch a cold.
Yeah.
It's the same way if in the plant world, and it is amazing how similar we are to the plants. If that plant is short of one nutrient, we can apply it through organic foliar feed and bring that immune system up to a balance where we don't have bugs or disease. Right. And once we have photosynthesis working well and nutrients and that plant health and that plant, any excess goes into the root, goes into the soil, then we start an engine going the other way. And we can increase organic matter, we can increase production, we can increase so many things, the farmer's actual dollars.
Absolutely.
I do want to make this point because I think you're not to confuse soil health with organic.
Yeah.
And I think it's unfair to say every person who is not organic is not paying attention to the soil.
No.
So, and I know you guys aren't saying it, but
Yeah.
I just want to make sure. So my husband's family farm, very diverse. I mean, if you wanted to see chickens, pigs, ducks, anything that flew in, they'd take care of it and, maybe raise it as a pet. But my point is, right now, the people farming the Darwin's family farm, the young man is a leader in conservation. He's not organic, but he is a leader in soil conservation. I was the only senator, I'm pretty sure, that had a soil column in my front office. They always show, if you represent Coca-Cola, if you're from Georgia, you're going to have a Coke bottle there. You all want to show off your products from your state. And people would just say, why do you have that dirt there? I said, number one, It's dirt when you do what people are doing to the soil, right? That's when it becomes dirt.
Yes.
It's soil.
It's soil.
And soil is the single most important natural resource of North
We
Dakota.
absolutely have to.
90% of our land base is engaged in production agriculture. If we don't prepare and work with the soil, we will fail. Now, in the good movement, what's happening right now is many people who were resistant to any discussion about climate are looking at the climate discussion as American agriculture saying, I think there's something going on here that we need to address, but what's in it for me? Because these are 60-year-old people who have been doing something the same way over and over again. And so how do you persuade them to adapt? And you do it by, here's a great example. We had there's a program called EQIP, which is a USDA program. It's how do you graze in a smaller unit, right? So you move fences and you move water, and everybody thinks there's overgrazing, but that can be better for the soil. And so these are all soil conservation measures. It's underprescribed, which means overprescribed, which means there's more demand for this than what there is money available. During the drought, we actually, the farmers who had adapted and used EQIP and used the rotational grazing actually had better water retention. They didn't have to buy hay. They could feed their cows. And they had green pastures. And guess what happens? The neighbors look across and say, they drive slow by, and then they say, what is he doing? And it is critical that we engage not as a criticism of farmers, but as a way to actually engage and make it possible for people to adapt new techniques. But soil conservation is the single most important challenge we have in American agriculture today, and respecting soil and not using practices that diminish soil to dirt.
Absolutely.
So that's
Right?
good. Those are good distinctions.
well said.
I want to say you all have really nosy neighbors. That's really something. I also want to say, Marty, thank you for making me feel good about sometimes feeling like a plant. I think I want to because we're going to go to questions in less than 10 minutes. So if you have them, start thinking of them, start being ready. You know where the mics are. But I do feel like it's really important to bring this back to the top, at least for sure, in terms of personal history here in the state of Illinois, in our country's history, and the relationship. And you both have different personal relationships to that. And Jahari, I hope I have this right. I believe that the county where you are now, at one point was the largest concentration of black farmers north of the Mason-Dixon line. And that's been a very complicated and painful history that has been tried to be addressed even recently in legislation. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that and what your relationship like that is to that as a current contemporary farmer.
Sure. Nearly 100 years ago, I would say even in the state of Illinois, there were reported over 7,000 African American farmers in the state of Illinois alone. Now there's less than 200. That's on record. And there may be some more out there that's not necessarily like registered with FSA or other, other organizations. But yeah, so it's dwindled down significantly. A lot of those farmers are within Kankakee County area, mainly in our community, which has been trying to maintain and retain the health of the African American farmers in that community, all these years. So we're struggling, but a lot of times, and what's happened over the years is that, you were not considered a farmer unless you had 200 acres or more. Remember, there was a stigma from the federal government. So typically, you were considered a hobby farmer. Or a truck patch farmer, so you weren't really given the attention, the financial assistance, needed to stay alive, to stay afloat, regardless of, and I did a lecture one time and I always said, don't bite the hand that feeds you. Just being mindful that, people it's a huge civic service to want to be a farmer because it's long hours. And it's a lot of work, and not a lot of pay. And so but to get up every day and do that grind every single day, just to not just feed yourself, everybody like, well, are you really profiting? Well, I don't do it specifically for profit. The primary purpose for farming for me is to feed my family. We know what we're eating, we're growing our own food, and this and that. That's the primary goal. And then I love the fact that I can grow more to share with everyone else. If we don't take that attitude, you can really get some disillusion from that romanticism of farming. You have to have a serious and a core reason for wanting to get up and do that every single day. I commend any farmer that does that. And so just trying to get the support needed for these smaller farmers has been the challenge.
Right.
And that's where we are today.
And I thank you for presenting that as service too, because I think the pandemic, just as it's redefined what we think of as essential, it's also redefined for many of us what we think of as a service profession. So I thank you for making that point. How do you respond to that, and how do you see, farming in terms of the broader justice movement in the country?
Part of one of the things when we first started the farm of produce and all of these things, what we were going to do with our land, we also looked around and saw, as many communities throughout the Midwest and probably beyond, their young people moving away and not coming back to farm, and we wanted to change that. So we created this group of an opportunity for young people, young families to join, and we would help do this marketing and distribution. At the very beginning of 25 farms that we had, the vast majority were under the age of 18. We now have nearly 70, 75 farms in this group, and lots of women-owned farms, lots of non-white farms, lots of young people still farming, retired veterans, LGBTQ farmers, and we are really, really, really trying to create these opportunities throughout the communities that we serve. And I want to hear a new farmer's dream, and then I want to work to help them realize that.
Absolutely.
And that's where we are, and just trying our very best to be as inclusive and farming. I'm sorry, Johari, but the seed doesn't know. It understands the emotion and the power that plants it there, but it doesn't care who planted it there.
No, not at all. Absolutely not.
I'm curious in the audience, how many of you grew up with a garden?
Way to go.
That's quite
Great.
So you grew up eating food that you actually raised.
Excellent.
I mean, and I think that connectivity is critical if we're going to look at what we do going into the future in agriculture. You need to be connected with the food that you're putting in your mouth. Doesn't mean that it all has to be done this way or that way. But, if you grew up the way I did, you grew up canning, you grew up freezing, you grew up doing, putting up canning the chicken. And these are all skills that all of a sudden emerged after you couldn't find canning lids, right?
Right.
You couldn't find canning lids during the pandemic because all of a sudden now you couldn't buy flour. North Dakota owns a mill. It's part of our political heritage. We shipped huge amounts of flour to Washington, D.C. To basically distribute and make the point, look, this is connected to a farm. And so to me, the future of farming has got to be in the connectivity, and it's got to be in the area where you don't bring judgment, you bring a new ethic to how we look at the food chain and how we distribute food and how we find equality in there's thing. You might say, well, Cargill or, the big pasta manufacturers. So when this happened, when the pandemic happened, there's a food distribution center at Spirit Lake, which is one of our reservations, probably the poorest of our reservations. They also serve Turtle Mountain. And my friend Mary called me and I said, what can we do, Mary, to make sure that you don't have a commodity shortage in your food distribution center? I picked up the phone and I called the North Dakota Mill. I called Cargill for oils. I called Dakota Pasta for some pasta to be shipped. All of these, what you would consider large evil groups maybe, they all rose to the occasion and they shipped pallets of food to the food distribution center so that not only could we connect them to the supply, but we could actually kind of realize we're all in it together. And so don't lead with judgment, lead with new ideas on how we can make the food system more secure into the future and safer and better for all of you.
Well, on that note, we'll definitely turn to some questions from the audience. We'll hit the center up later for her canned chicken recipe. I'm curious about that.
Listen, there is nothing better in the world than mashed potatoes with warmed up canned chicken in a gravy that my mom used to do. Pour that over the top. You've never eaten anything better.
We'll sidebar on that. We'll definitely take the first three questions. We do definitely reserve for students. Don't be shy. Step up. Let's. I know I didn't get to all the things I wanted to ask, so I'm hoping you guys will cover some of that yourself. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Graham. I'm a first-year MPP student at Harris School. I was wondering, this is probably mostly to the senator, but kind of what your thoughts are on kind of the subsidies around non-nutritive food, and particularly corn and ethanol, and if there's a future of moving away from foods that may not be best for people and the way we subsidize them now.
Yeah, there's a big controversy about corn-based ethanol and whether that is actually bio-based. I think we're seeing, one of the things that doesn't get talked enough about is, as part of that processing, we produce a really high quality feed source for livestock. And so it's not just taking the corn and making ethanol and that's it. There's, in fact, Canada is a huge export market for us out of ethanol. I think the folks in ethanol realize that they need to come to the climate world. We're seeing a lot of work around carbon capture behind ethanol plants that can be and sequester the CO2. I think there's still a need, and I will put a shout out for biofuels because I think corn ethanol gets a lot of the attention, but we have one of the largest biofuels, biodiesel fuel plants that use basically canola to make biofuels. This is part of the diversification that I think is essential in the energy supply chain. Now, I think there's going to be tremendous pressure on the ethanol industry as we look at shortage of grains, looking at, kind of depending upon what happens in Ukraine, if we can't see an extension or a further growing in Ukraine of these grains. But I think it's too early to say that the renewable fuel standard now needs to be eliminated in favor of producing corn that is going to be used only as a grain source and not as a fuel source. About 30% of all the corn grown in the Corn Belt is converted to biofuels.
Sorry, I guess my question is more around it was more around the export of corn as a food and kind of the health implications that has had around the world.
Export of corn as food and
high fructose corn syrup and other non-nutritive foods.
There's a lot of, I think, criticism of the corn industry because of high fructose sugar as a replacement for sugar sources and whether that has become the toxic addiction ingredient in all these foods. I think the corn producers are producing to market, and you see corn prices now at record high. You can say, well, should they be subsidized at record high? But it still is an essential input into the global food chain and the global food market that is essential for feeding the world. And so if I were here representing the corn growers, I would say, look, we're producing what people want to buy. And if that changes, we'll change what we're doing. But I want to do a shout out for technology. So Bushel, which is it's a startup in Fargo, North Dakota. What Bushel is doing is trying to calculate for because every bushel of corn is fungible, right? You aren't going to see, oh, that's produced on a farm that uses no-till practices and does soil conservation different than this one. What they're trying to do is identify those differentiating kind of characteristics of how something is produced, whether it's produced sustainably, and then see what the market will provide for premium for a product that is sustainably produced. But I'm not here to apologize for the corn industry. I just know that what they would say is, at $8, $9 corn, we're going to keep growing corn. Yeah.
Step right up.
Hi, I'm Jackie. I'm a fourth year in the college. Thank you all for joining us today. I had a question more so about farming and immigration policy. So I'm from Wisconsin, and I'm from a multi-generational family of Mexican migrant farmers. And I was wondering if you've noticed, I was wondering if you could speak on immigration policy and its effects on the food supply chain and the agricultural industry at large, especially since many of our agricultural workers are immigrants. Have you noticed any differences between administrations or with passing of certain immigration policies?
I have just briefly during a time where our last administrator, president and the presidential administration, I noticed a lot of the, the typical immigrant workers, like in our area, they were not working farms. They were so afraid of ICE coming to farms and all of the known farms that were in our area literally were having problems with finding, workers because of that. That was a huge issue. And I'm not sure of what you experienced, but we noticed that quite a bit in our area. Yeah.
And I have to say, as far as I'm aware, for the most part, I don't know that any of our farms have any temporary workers or hire that, use that as a resource. Most of them are all family, and so I really can't speak to that very well. I'm sorry.
Yeah. What I would say, Jackie, is if you look into the Midwest, a lot of since they're not picking fruit or vegetables where we are, they're basically working in food processing. And one of the things we saw that was horrific during the pandemic is people not having a voice about their safety at the working place because they were afraid to speak up because of their status. And there's a Amnesty International report about fruits and vegetable workers basically being exploited at record numbers because we have not figured out how to protect undocumented workers in this country. Yeah. And it is a tragedy, and everyone in this country should understand that apple that they're eating, or that cherry that they're eating, or that lettuce that they're eating is on the backs of people who aren't protected in this country, who need to be protected.
Absolutely.
And there is a reckoning for us eventually. And you cannot read the Amnesty International report about what happens to undocumented farm workers on these farms and not be outraged as an American that we've done nothing about it, because we're too interested in a low-cost food supply. That we don't realize that it's not just the soil and the farmers, but it is the people who are working every day to put that food on our table. And so, I would say you can't talk about ag policy without talking about immigration reform.
And that's what we were talking about earlier as far as what the true cost of food is.
Yeah.
And the true cost of food is something that everyone needs to have, it should be taught in the universities even, the breakdown of that, because remember, a lot of the cheap food is off of the backs of cheap labor. Somewhere, somebody's actually paying that cost.
You made such a good point at the beginning about the agrarian, myth. Oh, this is so great. It was all on the back of free labor.
It was free labor.
Yeah.
And now it's cheap labor. A lot of our imported foods, from Mexico, the Mexican workers are getting less than $200 a month. And this was in 2019 stats, right before the pandemic, pre-pandemic. So it might be creeping up to that cost now, but less than 200 a month.
And I would
insane.
recommend, so you get real sympathy, find a farm where you can pick 5 acres of cucumbers. And,
Yes.
you have really a lot of sympathy for workers who are getting paid $200
Absolutely.
a month.
Blueberries will do it too.
Yeah.
Next
Yeah.
question, sir.
I bought my first horse picking blueberries for a whole summer.
Tough stuff, man.
Sure did.
Hi, everyone. Zach Cran. I'm a second-year MPP at Harris. My point, I'm originally from a small farm town in north central Ohio. My point's kind of off of Jackie's right there. We had a very fertile area near where I grew up called the Muck, and it was like pitch black dirt. It was from the glaciers, from the Great Lakes and everything. And it was largely farmed by undocumented workers. In addition to that, we were also a big manufacturing community. GM had like a 1,500 person assembly plant near me that vanished during the financial crisis. I was hoping that somebody could speak to the future of farming. There's an appropriate level of romanticism around farming in this country. It's been the backbone of our country for 200 years. But the reality is small family farms are disappearing, just like those manufacturing jobs have disappeared. So what is a solution to the future of farming that's based in reality and not in our heads about like how beautiful it is, these vast open pieces of land? Is it vertical farming on a small scale? Is it just subsidizing small family farms more than we already do? Or is it something else?
I think when one of the things I always used to think about is when Cuba faced the oil crisis, all farmers became like senators because everyone turned their attention to feeding Cuba. And it just bloomed where everyone had to farm, people were farming everywhere. And you saw vertical farming, you saw small backyard farmers. Everyone was involved in producing food for the culture. And now it's still in that way where it's become respected. So breaking down the larger farms, into smaller farms is one of the things that we're going to have to do, but we got to respect those farmers. Anytime, I always tell all of our farmers, if you sell 1 penny, you are commercial. You're selling any of that, you become responsible for whoever's on the other side of eating your food. So we need to respect anyone who decides to go into business of farming and treat them exactly like that as a commercial farmer with the support necessary to help that farm to grow and sustain itself.
Could you add to that and maybe also, per that question, maybe even address the types of federal programs and the types of legislation that might be needed to realize, I think, some of what's inherent in that question.
And with that, it was, I opened with the muck portion because this is directly affecting undocumented workers who were able to work on smaller scale farms and now are either being exploited by larger corporate farms or just don't have any work whatsoever. So they're kind of just flapping in the breeze.
Again, that's the cheap labor scenario, right? So we need to stop that. We need to start looking at and supporting the smaller farms that, regardless of who's working on the farm, we need to support those farms. And legislation needs to be done to do that. It's been where a lot of the smaller farms, like I said earlier, could not get into the subsidy market, okay? So those were not necessarily given to smaller farms. I'm not sure if it's in the case of what you can experience.
We don't get any subsidy
No
at all.
subsidies.
Zero.
Yes, and and one of the things that sustain larger farms are a lot of the subsidies, that's given. And so if we can you turn that around where anyone that's in the farming business can do that, we'll see a lot more smaller farms being able to stabilize themselves and survive.
Marty, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. We don't receive any government subsidies at all. And I get asked a lot of times where people will say, well, you're just a niche farm.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, I'm going to tell you what, that's great. We are. And I'd like to see 1,000 more niche farmers.
Yeah.
And that's how I feel like we can continue to feed our community. And I'm thrilled that Livingston County has as many small food farmers, and we have our name on menus, or we have, food going here, there, and everywhere. That's awesome, but we're not even close to being able to feed one whole community.
Yeah.
So I do want to get to another question, Senator, but I just wanted you to respond to that quickly if you could, because you've obviously been in the rooms where this type of legislation and this debate over farm subsidies has gone on.
Well, I think is the land-grant college, Zach, a subsidy? I mean, I think you could argue that it is. And so what I would say is, as you kind of look forward, what has worked to basically create a production system that has, in fact, taken some risk out of farming, made sure that people, even small family farmers who couldn't otherwise take $1 million, I'm not kidding, a farm that is 5,000 acres could easily have $1 million worth of inputs.
Easily.
So how do you keep them on the land without even getting bigger?
Right.
You do it by providing some financial security, which is really what crop insurance is. I mean, we eliminated direct payments until Trump came back with direct payments because of what happened with destroying the China market. I mean, direct payments were on their way out. So I think that there's universal acceptance, political acceptance for crop insurance being a major safety net. The question is, does that subsidize unnecessary risk or bad farming practices? And there's always that pressure between, if you're taking federal money, how much control should the federal government have of your practices on soil, your swamp buster, your sod buster? I mean, I could go through all of the restrictions. Well, people in my state hate those restrictions, but they sure love this subsidy.
Exactly.
Right? And so, you know, we're now at that point where we're talking about incentivizing different kinds of methods of growing and soil conservation. And I'm proud of the work that I did at BPC with Saxby on natural climate solutions. We think that these are some strategies that'll move forward, and we have paid very close attention to what that means for those farmers who have been left behind historically. African Americans, and in my case, Native American farmers. So, we could debate farm subsidies and probably go on, but I'm telling you what the reality is today and how we can change that reality by incentivizing better behaviors through better education, through more awareness of what we're doing long-term to the soils.
And I would like to just add quickly that, it's all relative in terms of size. So where there are million plus in terms of need, equipment costs and things like that, we may be on the scale of 100,000.
That's
to
a lot
get
of money.
one, and it is.
It is, yeah.
To get one implement for me, my tractor, which is a small tractor, is over $20,000 for a small farm, and that's not including implements. The implements are over $5,000. So when you start adding all of those costs up, then you're literally over nearly 100. Oh, I haven't even mentioned the coolers.
Yeah.
That you need, the coolers needed to keep, and the transportation. I didn't even mention that. So by the time a small family farming only on 5 acres, I'm still going to need $100,000 worth of equipment and costs, inputs, just to get my food delivered to mutual stores or restaurants or feeding someone's plate.
And the argument that she has is that if you're going to subsidize the $5,000 or 5,000 acre farm and guarantee a safety net, they need to be guaranteed a safety net. Because they don't know if crop failure is going to happen or an early frost could wipe them out. And now she's got $100,000 invested, probably secured some of that by a loan, and she may lose everything that she's worked for. And so I'm for finding a safety net for everybody who produces our food.
You've been waiting so patiently.
Yeah.
Bring it.
My name is Bo Simon. I'm a 4th year in the college. So you mentioned, coronavirus and climate change and global conflict all are contributing to food insecurity, and GMO products have been pointed to as a way to increase food security internationally. At the same time, organic farmers, especially in the U.S., can charge a premium for that organic certification from the USDA, but cannot use GMO products if they want that certification. So I'm curious if you feel that changing that certification process, given research about GMOs not necessarily being detrimental to health or the environment, is something that the USDA should consider to increase food security and profits to farmers.
That's a sticky question.
Yeah.
As a microbiologist.
That's a great question.
It's a great question.
Yes.
And that's a sticky one to me. I'm an old school microbiologist. That's my background. And and genetics major. So it's still, as far, there, I guess during the time that I came up, there wasn't any long-term research done on what GMO crops would do to the environment or how they would play a role even, internally in our bodies. So we're still, and some of that information is still out there on the fringe, right? So, but when I talked about the organic standards being pushed, that's one of those things that's being pushed over the edge. There were sound reasons for not dealing in investing in GMO products back then. They're still sound to this day, but it's still one of those great areas. I think a little bit more research needs to be done. Yeah, that's my answer, and I'm sticking with it.
I want to make sure we get to the other two questions, but Marty, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that?
I'm going to hold.
You're going to hold
I'll
back
my
on that one?
I want to respond to that because I got caught in the middle of GMO labeling, and a lot of grain farmers obviously don't want GMO labeling because they think there's nothing wrong with GMO products. They'll point to rice that's been modified to basically prevent blindness in people moving forward. And so the jury probably is still out, but do not conflate non-GMO with organic. Those are two different things, and I think that's one thing we can all agree on here.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Thank you all for your time today. My name is Shane Griffey. I'm a first year at Chicago Booth, the business school. My question is related to innovation in ag tech. It seems like a lot of the big venture capital firms, ag tech is the hot thing to invest in right now. And a lot of the technology, vertical farming, as was mentioned earlier, lab-grown meat, some of the expensive automated harvesting robotics aren't things that actually affect, smaller scale farming operations. So we'd love to hear from your perspective what investment or innovation would make, your farming operations more successful or actually, have a beneficial impact in rural America.
Oh, anything that will keep me out of the garden, I'm all for it. I have a robotics team. I had a robotics team for a long time. And last year we did a robotics camp, and they focused on creating a robot to feed the crops. To feed specifically Mississippi crowder peas. And the robot was the kids, they developed it on their own to see how they could stay out of the garden as much as possible and what that would look like. And so they created a little robot that was basically a big watering pen that would go down the rows and spray mist. And they took all kinds of things into consideration. They made it solar, the whole thing. And they presented it in Springfield, which we were in cahoots with University of Illinois, I apologize. So any robot technology has a place even in organic ag. It has a place anywhere. Did we just invest in a pea sheller? Heck yeah. I told my grandma I was not shelling another pea when I grew up. I ended up shelling too many more. And so buying an automatic pea sheller, that's the evolution of farming. But there still needs to be something where we're not compromising our integrity, So, yeah, technology plays a huge role in ag.
For us, the biggest game changer was this sap testing, sap analysis that we use on multiple crops across the farm. In 1 year, we were able to do a couple things. Eliminate potato beetles just by understanding that we needed more phosphorus and we needed more iron in that plant. We totally, and we were able to have, yields increase exponentially. And the same way with some of our food grade corns. So much so by just 2 applications, understanding what that plant really needed at the right time, we tripled our yield. And even this past year with our wheat, we had the highest yield. We had 105 bushel wheat.
Wow.
Oh, awesome.
That was the highest of anybody in our area, whether it was organic or not. So I know that we can produce more food, we can produce more profit for our farm by using these technology pieces. And I'm
Absolutely.
really excited about it.
One of the questions is what's happening in hydroponics and growing, reducing the distance to which we move food. We're not going to grow lettuce in North Dakota, but can the tribe, a 3 affiliated tribe, which is an oil-rich tribe, it's the one that's right in the middle of the Bakken, is now looking at using their excess natural gas to basically do hydroponics and grow food for native communities. And so you're going to see a lot of technology. It may not look like going out and planting a soil or having a sensor or doing sap testing. So the next generation may be, container gardening that is scaled up to the point where we don't have to move, a head of lettuce 5,000 miles or 3,000 miles to eat lettuce in North Dakota.
I think we could sneak in one more, please. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Nancy Smith. I'm a first-year MPP. I just had a question.
Can you?
Oh yeah, sorry.
There you go.
Nancy Smith, first-year MPP.
I'm old. I'm hard of hearing.
I just had a quick question about meat industries, and particularly the beef industry, and some of the criticism that's been levied against it for being the least sustainable and having some of the biggest carbon footprints. I'm curious if you all had any thoughts on how to make meat and maybe in particular beef industries more sustainable with less of an impact on the environment.
Yeah, but I know that there are a lot of regenerative farms that are bringing cattle into the play. So they're mixing that. It's not, so it's just literally, like I said, changing that mindset, changing the paradigm of how farming is done, not necessarily getting rid of the beef which is considered the culprit. It's how they are grazed and raised is the culprit. And so just being able to just shift that to more, a lot of them, like the senator mentioned earlier, how they're using that to fertilize.
Yeah.
The paddocks are used to fertilize other things coming along behind that, other crops coming along behind that, in a very complementary kind of way. So yeah, it's the beef industry could still thrive, absolutely. It's just, again, it just needs to be done in a particular way that does not compromise the integrity of what we need to do for a holistic food system.
Beef, pork, chicken, turkey, all of those in our farmers group basically are all pasture raised.
Yeah.
And we don't have any confinement animals. We're distributing that waste product back into the soil and into the biology of that soil and making our pastures better, making really tasty meat.
I think when you look at it, understand kind of the West. The land that is being used to raise cattle is marginal and needs to be grazed. I mean, we've lost the buffalo, and so if we're going to have healthy rangeland, we need grazing. Okay, so when you look at water concentration, I mean, one of the concerns, it's not just climate and methane, it's how much water is used to produce an animal unit. We're seeing more like large dairies doing methane digesters. So we're seeing some changes in practice, and we need to incentivize those changes in confinement operations. But in the long run, we get into this, and I don't mean to be insulting, but we get into this cow fart, dialogue, right? Oh, well, all those greenies, they're worried about cow farts. They want to shut down, hamburger because cows fart. I mean, and so it creates kind of a narrative where people in maybe more conservative areas go, yeah, we gotta stop that dialogue, or we gotta stop them from taking away our cows. And so when we don't have communication, right? When we don't actually have a respectful sit down, what are we going to do? And you're going to get 30% of the people probably in rural America who don't believe climate. They believe climate's a hoax. But when you do studies in North Dakota, huge energy, huge ag state, 60% of the people think we need to do something about climate. So how do we talk to those 60% in a way that achieves meaningful climate goals? And that's really what we did with Natural Climate Solutions, the work that we were doing at BPC.
that's where we need to have that dialogue. But I will tell you that large operators are now really concerned about methane and methane emissions, and they're looking at how they can use methane as a way to basically produce other byproducts. And so it's not just, it's growing unsustainably. There's people who really understand they need to change practices.
Well, on that note, I think we are going to end our respectable exchange of ideas here. And I thank you to all of you, and especially for tying food and food policy to other policy issues in our country.
Can I say something? Can we give a shout out to the people who produced the food tonight and
Which
brought the
stems
food?
from Spence Farms.
I don't know, is the chef or is the restaurant in? Can somebody stand who actually cooked the food?
Well,
We knew you grew
I
up.
think it was all catered in.
It was catered in, and it was stems. Next time, Tahar, you'll bring your eggs, I hope.
Yes, I'll bring
Season this time. Thank you to our guests so much, and thank you all for coming out tonight and a little bit of drizzle to have this important conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.